Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 24/7. I am Cody Goodwin. We've got the whole band back together, Mike Rodak and Alex Scarborough for today's show. A lot of exciting things on the sports calendar nowadays, guys. We're recording this on Thursday morning. The NFL is officially back tonight, which means we've got nothing but football between now and early February, literally every single weekend, whether it's college or the NFL. I know I'm probably one of the few diehard NFL fans down here in the South, but I'm excited. I'm also very, very thrilled that Alex is back because I have something I need to get off my chest, Alex. I know you were busy this weekend, and we will get into why you were busy this weekend, but I wasn't sure if you caught the box score from the Vanderbilt-Virginia Tech game.
Take your victory lap. Come on.
My man, Diego Pavia, 12 of 16, 190 yards, 2 touchdowns, also ran for 100 yards and another touchdown. Vanderbilt with maybe one of the more head-turning results from week one, 34-27 over Virginia Tech. They got up big, blew the lead, came back to ultimately win in overtime. Diego Pavia, man, looked pretty good.
Yeah, he did. I think he said he got a little annoyed at the poor man's Trace McSorley. He thinks he's more like Johnny Football. I would argue if you're Vanderbilt, you're more like Jonathan Football. But I don't know. Virginia Tech's trash. I mean, the lunch pail defense might as well be a brown paper bag the way they were playing against him. But it was a good start. He's a fun player to watch. I just don't know how sustainable it is when they get into SEC action.
I just felt like it was the first great showing of, and again, I think I said this as we talked about him quite a bit through the summer. I don't think he's going to turn Vanderbilt into a 7-8 win team. But I do think he's going to wreak some havoc, right? And like that game in Nashville, Alabama goes out there early October. That could be kind of fun, man. I don't know. Like, I just think he's just a wild card.
Yes, and he will be a coaching point for every team that faces him, that if you sleepwalk into this game, he will run right past you. Well, yeah, again, what that will mean in the win-loss column, I don't know, but maybe they will jump up and surprise somebody.
I just wanted to give you a little bit of trouble for that to kick off today's show.
You earned it. I gave you grief over your obsession with Diego Pavia, which sounds like a made-up name and a made-up football player by EA Sports. So you've earned it. You've earned it.
Speaking of EA Sports, we're going to get to – I ran the Week 2 simulation on our EA CFB 25 sim last night. Again, recording this on Thursday. So we'll touch on that when we get to the Alabama-South Florida discussion on today's show. That game's on Saturday, 6 p.m. kickoff, Bryant-Denny Stadium. Saban Field at Bryant-Denny Stadium officially going to be unveiled this weekend. We'll discuss that game here in a little bit. But, Alex, I did want to talk to you a little bit about why you may not have watched Diego Pavia this weekend, and also why you weren't in the press box with us on Saturday in Tuscaloosa. You were actually in College Station working on a really, really good story, basically shadowing Nick Saban at his first week one college game day at Texas A&M ahead of the A&M Notre Dame game. You basically took us behind the scenes, cracked open the curtain as much as they allowed you to follow him throughout the entire day. I'm just kind of curious your overall takeaways just from getting to watch Saban go through his first on-campus college game day experience.
Yeah, I'll start at the very beginning. I was just kind of stunned to walk in at 7:15 in the morning, and Nick Saban's right there in a chair getting hair and makeup done with like nobody else around him. Like, we're used to an entourage. We're used to him going places, doing things, being antsy when he has to sit still. And he was chill, man. He was just, this is my life now. And really has just overall leaned into the experience to the point that I have never seen this man happier. Like, even when he wins the national championship, he's happy. But his brain's already thinking, oh, man, I missed this in recruiting. We got to do this in terms of the transfer portal. There's all these wheels that are turning that I think this semi-retirement phase of his life is really interesting and fun to see. I mean, we all saw him shout at the end of the show, "This is so much fun." Mm-hmm. Like, that was real. And to get to see the way he interacts with the fans, I was a little surprised they didn't give him more grief over his war of words with Jimbo Fisher a few years ago. That's all done and in the past. But his interaction with the fans. But then the big takeaway for me, honestly, is The Pat McAfee thing is real. Like, they're the two most opposite human beings you could ask for in dress, in personality, in the way they take things seriously and they don't. And yet, like, I had somebody on the crew tell me it's the most unlikely bromance of all time. And it's real. Like, I saw Pat rubbing Nick's shoulders and being like, come on, let's do it, coach. And Nick can't help but crack a smile. So I think that has really elevated a show that's always been great. I think it's just brought this added thing to it that's elevated it even more and made it more interesting. And it's as much Nick would be great on his own, but the Nick McAfee thing and the dynamic there that exists is really, really cool to see.
Mike, I wanted to loop you in here too, because we all have watched almost everything that Saban has been doing with ESPN over the last few months. I know that our big takeaway coming out of SEC Media Days is that for a while maybe not for a while, but there will be times this season where we're kind of covering two head coaches, with Saban being on game day and him being a pretty big, one of the stars of the show at SEC Media Day still, even though he's not a coach anymore. One of the points Alex made in his story, the dude just looks like he's having a lot of fun. He seems really relaxed. He seems to have really leaned into this role seamlessly. I think we all expected that, just knowing who he is. Mike, I'm curious, just as someone who has really watched him, really watched all of his shows, all of his game day stuff, all of his SEC Media Day stuff. Like, do you agree with that, or how would you kind of assess the way Saban has taken to this new role?
Yeah, I mean, it all makes sense to me. It's look, would he be doing it for free? I don't know. So like, let's remember that he's getting paid well to be up there and to be smiling and to go along with all of the predictions and the things that he doesn't want to do or hadn't wanted to do his entire career. He got paid to be on the McAfee show last year. Like, would he have gone on for free for Pat McAfee last year? I tend to doubt it. So there's still that part of it, that, it's still a job for him and he's trying to do the best he can in a paid job. And I think that's how he's wired. And I think he wants to be his best all the time. So, that's what comes across to me. But yeah, it's a situation where he was in that bubble for so long as a coach, where he's shuffled between different things, and the state troopers next to him, and Josh Maxson next to him, and Cedric Burns next to him, and just all these people kind of in his orbit, making sure that his life moves perfectly efficiently. And I think now that he's kind of away from that to a certain degree, that he's just kind of realized, hey, like, this is what it's like to live a normal life. And I think he's probably realizing that and I think he's talked about that too, where you're not in a hurry all the time, and it's just a slower pace. So, it's kind of a both ends of it. I can see. I think he probably truly does like Pat McAfee, because it probably reminds him of being in a locker room and having that sort of personality in a locker room, which I'm sure there's been at Alabama. Terry and Arnold is probably, not a perfect corollary to Pat McAfee, but I think a little bit similar in that, like, he's very kind of jovial and, hey, coach, and he's got really close to Saban. And I think Saban likes having that around. So, but at the same time, again, it's a job. I think he's trying to put his best foot forward. He always talks about watching film of all these teams and talking to all these coaches and like putting together a scouting report like he's playing the team this week when he's really not. I think he just likes doing that too. So
I think you hit on two important things. One, which is Nick talked about it when he talked about ever retiring. It was always, I've been part of a team my whole life. I wouldn't know how to not be part of it. Right. This is the closest thing he can get to that without being part of a football team, because the thing that has made this show what it is the chemistry and the camaraderie that's existed on not just the people on stage, the people off of it who have worked on that show for a very long time. They travel together, they eat together, they do all these things. And Nick has a pre-existing relationship with a Reese Davis, with a Kirk Herbstreit, with a Pat McAfee. So he can slide in there, and there's that jocular feel that they have as a show that kind of, it does feel like a locker room in a sense. But the other part is, yeah, he did approach it like a job, where one of the producers told me, he's like, I'm not going to be able to call you coach on set because Corso's on set too. So what do you want me to call you? And he says, you can call me a-hole, you can say a-hole, for all I care. It's your job to get me where I'm going. And he, came out of one of the first production meetings and goes up to another producer and says, I need you to treat me like a rookie. Do not just give me the good news. You need to give me the bad news too, and tell me where I can get better. So he's approaching this like he wants to be really good at it. He already is really good at it. That's the thing. He's very natural with it. I think we've all seen it in press conference settings. If you followed Alabama enough, you know this, but I don't think the general fan has understood until just now how freaking funny he is when he's in the right mood, when he wants to be. He is quick. It's like the thing with Pete Thamel when they come back from break and he's wearing waders and the fishing pole. Nobody knows this is going to happen. And they start giving him grief, and Nick just jumps in and goes, if I saw that, I'd throw my headset. And everybody cackled. There was not planned. He just has that sharpness still to him, and that sharp sense of humor that, again, it's taken the show, which, again, was already good, but in its 37th season has breathed fresh air into it.
And I will say too, he was always good on game day when he was on as a coach, even, last season when Texas came. He's always been good. Game day has wanted him for a long time. Yes. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that he's good now, that he's actually fulfilled their wishes and their dreams over at ESPN for at least a decade. That I think has been under radar to get him on that show.
Let's just say there were a lot of texts exchanged in the immediate aftermath of Nick Saban's announcing his retirement. Is this going to happen? We want this to happen. And even Reese told me, he's like, look, as an Alabama alumnus, I want you to coach forever. As the host of Game Day, I want you here yesterday, because they knew the potential that existed there.
I'm curious, Alex, when you go and report a story like this, there's obviously a notebook full of things that you probably want to try and squeeze in. What's one interesting story or anecdote or scene or something that you weren't actually able to squeeze into this story that you thought was interesting, funny, awesome? What'd you leave on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, there was a lot of the kind of build up and getting him to the job kind of thing. Like I talked about the texts that were flying back and forth. How do we get him here? How do we fit him in? That kind of thing. The other part, again, speaking to the way he approached the job, Reese told me, he's like, they went out to dinner the night before the first show in Ireland. And he said it was him and Herbstreit and a couple other people. And they were just talking and talking. And the next day he woke up and he realized, man, all we did the whole dinner was talk shop and talk TV. And Nick's here and we're not getting any stories of football. And he tells us, Nick, and he goes, I don't want to talk about football. I need to hear what you guys are talking about. I need to understand how the television part of things work. So I tried not to get too in the weeds on that part, like Nick trying to understand what an intro and an outro is, what a rundown is, the fact that he doesn't have to look at every single team. They're only going to talk about 8 to 10 games every show. But again, just speaks to the level of detail that he's bringing to that job, which I don't think is necessarily a surprise to any of us.
I think the other big picture thing that I thought was really interesting in this story, Alex, and you hit on this, and Mike, I'm curious just what you think about what Saban's role could eventually evolve into, is that everybody always kind of sat on the edge of their seat when Nick Saban talked, whether it was about his team, whether it was about the opponent, whether it was about college football at large. And Alex, you wrote in the story that he more or less has a bigger microphone now than maybe he's ever had before, because of his position on game day, because of the respect he has around the sport, and how, effectively the NCAA, college football playoff, whatever entity is going to run this sport over the next 5 to 10 years would probably do well to sit and listen whenever Saban has something big picture to say. How important is that as part of this role on game day, or how important do you see this potentially being for Saban, for the sport moving forward?
Yeah, it was interesting when I was talking to Reese Davis. I asked him what he saw Saban's, what his role on the show is. And he really was trying to think. And he's he's going to be obviously the X's and O's guy. He's going to give you a coaching perspective. And he thought about it. He goes, I think this sounds ridiculous, maybe, but I think he's the conscience of the sport. And I went with both hands. I was that's exactly how I've always envisioned this. because Nick said immediately when he retired, he wanted to influence the trajectory of the sport. And my brain immediately went to, you can be an advisor for the NCAA or the SEC, probably, like David Cutcliffe does for the SEC, where you're really influencing the conversation behind closed doors. And I said this to Reese, and Reese goes, that's interesting. That might have worked. But when you're in those roles, there are people who have to answer to you and people who don't. And if they don't, they just tune you out. So his argument, and I think it holds weight, is that where he is now, because he's not confined to a single space and he holds the biggest megaphone in college sports, is even better for that. And look, I'm standing there. There's a center stage and then there's a stage left. And I'm standing behind the left-hand stage where Pete Thamel's interviewing Rich Clark, the executive director of the college football playoff. And on the main stage, of course, is Nick Saban. They're talking about the expansion of the 12-team playoff over there. And Rich Clark does not take his eyes off the monitor the entire time. And then they feed into an interview with Rich Clark, and it's like you're hearing the same things. Rich Clark talks about, it's the best teams, not the most deserving. And Kirk Herbstreit does this little nod like, yeah. And Nick is like, exactly right. It's proximity to power, too. Not just physically, but what do you think the selection committee is watching on Saturdays? They're watching Game Day. They're in their hotels in Grapevine, Texas, with nothing to do but watch Game Day. And Nick is going to be the voice there. And yes, they probably already listened to him before, but now they kind of have to. And now they can't brush him aside by saying, oh, he's got an Alabama bias. I think he's going to have an opportunity if he wants to, and I think he's going to use it to really influence the future of the sport and do it from outside of the sport, which is really kind of interesting.
And yeah, I'll say having that platform and saying whatever opinion you might have, it's going to get broadcast to millions of people up front, and then it's going to get written about and shared on social media. If he is an advisor behind closed doors and he's telling Greg Sankey or Tony Petitti or whoever, like, this is what you should do, nobody else is going to hear it. And if Sankey doesn't do anything about it, then it's wasted energy, really. So this is actually putting it out there more. But and I've always said this, I do think Saban as like the czar or the guy who's figuring out the new direction of college football is probably a slightly overrated concept to me, just because he's not a lawyer and he's not a TV executive. And that's what's going to decide what college football is going to look like next. And Saban has a lot of broad general ideas. I think a lot of them are rooted in how things used to be. He's somewhat of a purist in that way, but I think he's also a realist. But at the same time, like, I think the people in charge kind of know that already. Like, they know that Nick Saban thinks players should be paid legitimate name, image, and likeness deals, and he thinks they should be paid, but he doesn't think boosters should be involved. It's kind of an obvious concept that's already out there. And so if Nick Saban's an advisor and he's saying that, and I'm Greg Sankey, I'm like, yeah, no crap, bro. Like, we already know that. You know that's what you want, but how are we going to get antitrust law to actually do that? What's this law going to look like? What's the language of this law going to look like? Yeah, how is this all going to work? Are you a collective bargaining expert? Like, are you a labor expert? Have you sat on the National Labor Relations Board, Nick Saban? Like, if he does not have any of that stuff to bring to the table, then he's not going to be the guy who decides the direction of college football, because it's the NLRB, it's Congress, it's courtrooms in California where these cases have been decided. Those are the experts. It's Jeffrey Kessler. Those people are the ones shaping college football. So Nick Saban can sit there on game day set and say, I think college football should be this or that. And I think a lot of people might agree with him. But again, he's not a lawyer. He's not an expert. And I think his actual impact in that regard is going to be a little bit limited because he's doesn't have what it takes there. And that's not a knock against Nick Saban. I think he'd be the first one to tell you, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know how to solve some of these problems.
That's a fair argument. Behind the scenes with Nick Saban at ESPN's College Game Day, where he's quickly found his voice. Great story by Alex. Go check it out. Bama 24/7, 24/7 Sports. We put a link to it in the show notes.